Hello, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome back to Lecture 18 on Moral Skepticism. This is our final lecture for the course. You made it through, or hopefully you will make it through all 18 of these lectures. You made it this far at least, or maybe you've skipped ahead, I'm not sure. At any rate, we will discuss what Friedrich Nietzsche has to say about morality, discussing the reasons why he thinks essentially everything we've talked about throughout the course up to this point is based on fundamentally an illusion, right? This idea that there is a proper way to behave in the first place. And he's going to argue that, as we'll see, that no one actually, at least none of these philosophers, these people that we've examined, none of them actually stopped to ask the question, is there anything to this very idea of morality in the first place, right? They just instead tried to flesh out what doing the right thing looked like and how they can justify their particular slant on that. But none of them actually asked the question themselves, applied the critical eye, if you will, to the very issue of morality itself. And of course, that's what he's going to do. And so this will be a two-part video for lecture 18. In the first part, we'll discuss this dude, Friedrich Nietzsche. Who is he in the first place? We know that he's associated with moral skepticism, and that he's going to try to convince us that we've wasted our time this entire course. But let's find out a little bit more about him. Who is this guy trying to convince us of this? And to do so, we'll actually talk a little bit about Arthur Schopenhauer as well, because as we'll see, he had a profound influence in many, many regards on Nietzsche, and then ultimately what Nietzsche's up to. In some sense, I'll say his entire project, Nietzsche's, is aimed at refuting the underlying pessimism. So Schopenhauer is known as a pessimist, and for his pessimistic philosophy, refuting the underlying pessimism that's latent throughout Schopenhauer's works. And so to better position ourselves in terms of understanding what Nietzsche's up to in general and that general project of combating nihilism, but then so too to better understand what he has to say about morality, and I argue at times as well to understand what he has to say about religion and his criticisms of religion. We're going to talk a bit about his more general philosophy, specifically his naturalism, his naturalistic take on reality, his reductionist take on reality as well, reducing, what is reality down to the moment, now. We'll elaborate on that and how then that's going to influence, among other things, his view of that there are such things as objective standards that apply all the time to everyone. And then we'll talk about this view of will to power, which is pretty reminiscent of kind of Rand's take, as we've fleshed out. What was that, lecture 16? Sort of his picture of what life, if left to its own natural devices, and so including us, if acting naturally, what exactly all of life amounts to. He says it's will to power, and so we'll flesh out what he means there. And I meant to say in the first place, right? We just ended lecture 17, which was about moral relativism. And James Rachel's worries about moral skepticism, and so we're going to see through our discussions in both part one video and part two video the kinds of things he's worried about, and because of the kinds of conclusions Nietzsche is going to reach. Okay, and again, his conclusions regarding morality, right, are going to be rooted in this more general, philosophical outlook on reality, what it looks like, what life amounts to, whether we're talking about humans or, all of life in general. And so again, we'll flesh all that out. That'll put us in a better position then to talk about what we'll talk about in the part two video, where we'll take a more critical, a more detailed look, if you will, at what he has to say regarding morality itself, particularly, the master-slave distinction. And so we'll end the first part video discussing how he appreciates honesty in general, being honest regarding this sort of stuff, and his emphasis on embracing life as it is in its entirety. And I'll end by saying, well, and what we're going to see with the slave moral theories, which is 99% of us, because 99% of us would constitute what he calls a slave. They do not, right, acknowledge this sort of stuff. They engage in what he's going to say is dishonesty. They're not healthy. They can't handle the truth of life as it is in its entirety. And so what we'll do in the part two video then is we'll go through why that's the case, or how it is, or the reasons for him suggesting that's the case. So we'll go through in much more detail then his idea of master and slave moral theories, and as I'm going to suggest, more fundamentally, his take on master and slave mentalities. It comes down, yes, you can apply this to moral theories as he does, and we will, but it comes down to a more uh, fundamental level in some sense, to individual existential attitudes towards life. That's really what it comes down to. Now, he's been, I would argue, vastly misunderstood in many ways with respect to that, but the crux, right, of the master-slave distinction for Nietzsche comes down to one's fundamental view towards life. Do they accept it in its entirety, including all the pain and suffering therein? And that's going to be the key, because he doesn't think most people can accept it as it is. Or, right, can they not accept it as most people, and thus have to indulge then in a great deal of self-deception, dishonesty, in order to get by, in order to render life as comfortable as possible in order to get by. Now, that's what he's going to suggest is going on with the slave mentality, both in religious sort of manifestations and the belief of kind of an afterlife where everything will be made right, and so too in these ideas of there being proper ways to behave and these ideas of morality. He's going to root all of that in dishonesty and an inability on the part of most of us to handle reality as it actually is, to handle all the pain and suffering that just is in life. We have to, since we can't handle it, he's going to suggest that we have to, again, create these elaborate illusions to help us get by, which, interestingly, is reminiscent of Schopenhauer, right? It's all going to be indicative, as we'll see, of nihilism, this tendency to demean life, to not be able to accept and embrace life in its entirety. And so what's interesting is Schopenhauer is actually an atheist, right? And yet he's a full-blown skeptic, or not skeptic, nihilist. That represents the extreme version of nihilism, and we'll get into that. So it's interesting how both, we have all these religious examples of the slave mentality, right? But hey, just not being religious, that doesn't mean you won't be a slave either, right? Schopenhauer himself is actually a far worse slave, if you will, from Nietzsche's perspective than most religious individuals would be. Okay? So we'll flesh all of that out in much more detail in the part 2 video. Again, really going into detail with respect to the master-slave distinction, both with respect to individual mentalities and then obviously, moral theories. Okay? And we'll outline what exactly, Nietzsche's position is in more detail than in that part 2 video, specifically this. And by the way, here at the outset, let it be known that we always try to simplify things as much as possible in this introductory course. Philosophy is hard enough as it is. Okay, for us, moral skepticism is, amoralism is moral nihilism, right? So the editors of our textbook, right, they tend to refer to, Nietzsche's position as moral nihilism. I call it moral skepticism. Elsewhere, actually, in my dissertation, I read some of that to prepare for this. I tended to refer to it as Nietzsche's amoralism. It's all the same thing. Okay, it's um, basically the position that there is no such thing as morality, right? That it can't be defended. And then we'll wrap up the part 2 video by talking about some peripheral points. How Nietzsche thinks we ought to judge progress. Okay, are we doing well as a species? How ought we to look at that and examine that and then answer that question? We'll talk about related to this idea of there being sort of degrees of nihilism. We'll talk about his famous expression, "God is dead," which Zarathustra, exclaims to those in the marketplace, and thus spoke Zarathustra famously, right? That God is dead, and so Nietzsche is known for expressing this. And I'll talk about how that's been, as Nietzsche oftentimes is, vastly misunderstood and misinterpreted and so on. And that this is actually, when he says God is dead, we'll see, that's an expression of concern, not elation on the part of Nietzsche by way of Zarathustra, right? That, he's worried what's going to happen to these slavish religious individuals who, with the onset of science and logic, can't help but see through their illusions, right? And won't be able to help but see them for what they are, right? And will thus not have the life-preserving errors that were their religious beliefs in the first place. He's worried with that expression that they're going to then fall victim to a full-blown extreme form of nihilism, a la Schopenhauer, where life doesn't seem to have any meaning at all. Again, we'll flesh that out in much more detail in the part 2 video, but that's what you have to look forward to. And then we'll talk about as well the reading that we had for this lecture, which I mentioned, I think, in one of the previous videos, how I was disappointed that out of all the selections they could have taken from Nietzsche, look at all these books he's written, and what about this one? Beyond Good and Evil. You know, why they took the part on historicity that they did, and our ability to remember and reflect on the past, and focus on that rather than his criticisms of morality specifically. I don't know, but we will talk about then as well the reading and his reflections on our ability to reflect on the past, what's happened in the past, and so too to sort of anticipate what's going to happen in the future, and how, while in some sense we have a tendency to view that as an asset, a great thing, he'll actually, he talks about how it's burdensome and problematic. So that's again part 2, and actually I'll end part 2, the part 2 video of this lecture, by letting Nietzsche speak for himself. Nietzsche is one of the most quotable philosophers of all time, and I have a couple slides where I just literally have just quotes from him, where I think he himself in these quotes does a really good job of just capturing everything we will have talked about up to that point. So that's how we'll bring the part 2 video to a close. But at any rate, let's go ahead and turn our focus then to Nietzsche himself, and who was this guy. And by the way, this is kind of what he looked like. I brought in some props. This is actually only half, maybe not even half, the books I have on Nietzsche, and this was something a former student gave to me. I've gotten little things throughout my teaching experience, where students will run across things and give them to me, and it's always appreciated. And I've kept this. It's probably been 15 years that he's been in the library. So, but very prolific writer, Nietzsche. What a shock! Again, pretty much everybody we've talked about, it seems like, I'm bringing in a stack of books, saying how it's not even everything they've written or everything I have, right? And obviously these guys, what they do, oftentimes philosophers, is write. That's what they do for a living, so to speak. And Nietzsche, in some sense, was no exception. So clearly a lot to say. We're going to focus, I'll actually be talking about what he has to say in a lot of these different works. A lot of what he's more well known for in terms of what he says about morality tends to come from Beyond Good and Evil, naturally, or a book called The Gay Science, some from Human Ulti-Human, but really we're going to draw from a lot of these different works. He wrote 14 different works throughout his life, or really during his productive academic life, if you will, which was really the last 10 years of his life. So he was born 1844, died 1900, and the last 10 years of his life, he's sort of notorious for this, were spent under the care of his sister and or mother, or in asylums. He went crazy, more or less. So he wasn't, again, that was for 10 years. So his productive time period was, I don't remember exactly when he started, but essentially it was this decade, for what it's worth, the 1880s through, up to 1890. I think it was January 1890 that he sort of, according to legend, clutches the mane of a horse and refuses to let go. And at that point, I guess people realize he's kind of lost it. And at some sort of, at that point forward, he's kind of deemed insane. And so really his productive time, this always kind of impresses me, is really 10 years where he's writing not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, 14 books. Okay? I don't even know if I actually have them all in here. I do have all of his books, but a lot of these are written by Martin Heidegger, another philosopher. So a lot of these, Walter Kaufmann, this is written by him. So a lot of these aren't even the books by Nietzsche. But so obviously he's written a ton himself, and then lots of other people have written books on what he has to say naturally. Um, so I saw this one. Right, don't confuse books like this one with the actual book itself. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And while I'm thinking about it, I think I mentioned this in another video. Philosophy is hard enough, right? But you add on to that, some of these guys and girls are writing in different languages to begin with, and so then they have to be translated, and that's a huge issue, I would argue, especially in ancient philosophy. But then personally, I've experienced that with Nietzsche. So it's one thing to try to figure out what they're saying in the original language, but then when you have to rely on somebody else to try to figure out what that person was saying in the original language, and then to try to adequately convey, hopefully, the correct interpretation to then your own language, that can be a huge issue. And so I thought of this, speaking of this, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Uh, wow, what an interesting book in itself. The first time I read it, I read this version. I think it's the Thomas. Is it? Yeah, Thomas Common translation, and it was like reading Old English. It was a miserable experience. I really didn't like the book, at least I thought. And then, I had to take a class at Boston University where not only was it a class on Nietzsche, just Nietzsche, it was a class on just this book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Read a different version, the Walter Kaufman translation, and it was a totally different experience. So I know I'm pretty sure I mentioned and raised that point in an earlier video, and I can't underscore that enough. That you need to, if you become interested in this stuff and explore some of these guys in more detail, that is definitely a point you'll want to have in mind because you're going to take away two different things depending on whose translation you read. Um, Not only that, but his books in general or people's philosophy in general. I intimated earlier how he's been completely misunderstood and misinterpreted, notoriously in numerous ways. And this book is no exception. So even if we have a common translation and we seem to have the same thing there, it's amazing how different people can get different things from the same, seemingly the same thing. And so Hitler famously, uh, has his soldiers read this book because he construes the master-slave distinction as being, you know, along the lines of race, right? Whereas as I've already suggested, that is not the case with that is not actually the case. That is not what Nietzsche means. Now, Nietzsche does admittedly say things in certain ways at times where you could see why, if someone didn't have a fuller, uh, wider view of what Nietzsche is saying, it could be misconstrued in certain ways. But as I mentioned, it doesn't come down to race. You can be black, white, yellow, green, male, female, rich, poor, and you can still be a master or you can still be a slave. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You could be a rich CEO of some multi-billion dollar corporation, and yet if you sit there at your desk dwelling on the fact that you can't leave until 4:30 to go play golf when you really want to go right now, and that's the sort of thing that's indicative of your general mentality. You're a slave, right? You bemoan the pain and suffering in your life. Whereas conversely, you could be homeless out on the streets, and yet you don't dwell on that. You embrace life as it is, and you can be a master, right? So, um, again, vastly misinterpreted. We'll talk again, God is dead and how that's oftentimes misinterpreted in the part two video. But that's a prime example in my mind. Again, Nietzsche, one way he's misunderstood, and again, maybe that's just the nature of the beast. That's just philosophy, right? You start talking about this stuff, and maybe it's by nature so obtuse, right, that different people are going to take different things away from what you say. Maybe that's inevitable. Who knows? But I think it is of interest for us and worthwhile to point that out, right? That Nietzsche, especially, it seems like, has been interpreted in many different ways. And as I mentioned a moment ago, partly probably because he's translated, right? For many of us who encounter him, it's through a translated version of what he says, and so that just compounds the difficulties. Also another way that he's sometimes misunderstood, or a way, something that's indicative of how he might be misunderstood or misinterpreted is oftentimes, so I already mentioned that in some sense, his entire philosophical project is to combat what he calls nihilism, a tendency to depreciate earthly life. And yet, when people discuss nihilism, oftentimes the first person they think of is Nietzsche. So he's associated with nihilism in a lot of people's minds, and yet that is explicitly what he aims to refute through all of his, much of his philosophy. And again, it probably comes down to what people mean when they use certain terms. Oftentimes, many philosophers think that's the job of philosophy in general, is just to clarify things, right, and make it clear how, what seems like these vast differences. Well, we just mean different things when we say the same term. So, it makes sense when people call Nietzsche a nihilism, or a nihilist, if they mean by calling him a nihilist that he endorses moral nihilism. In other words, doesn't believe in morality, that there is such a thing as a proper or right way to behave, because he does. That's true, right? But what he means by nihilism, right, is not that. Okay, he's going to mean, again, this tendency to negate life, earthly life, the life we know. Okay, so Nietzsche himself, very interesting figure. I feel like I say that about everyone all the time, but in these videos, but he was truly an interesting character. He had basically, his father was a Lutheran pastor. I think both his grandfathers were involved in the church. And so, for so many of us, this is true, right? We either end up endorsing what our folks said, right, or we end up rebelling against it. And so, not surprisingly, maybe Nietzsche later on, right, is going to be well known for rejecting this sort of religious, worldview, right? But he grew up, very much in a religious household. His father died when he was only 4 years old, and this no doubt had a significant impact on Nietzsche. You can tell just sort of some of the things he says and the way he talks that this seems to have had a pretty significant impact on him, and that makes sense. Can't imagine that it wouldn't for most people, at least if they knew their father up until that point, right? To then suddenly have that important of a figure, especially if the father is there and in their lives and involved in their lives. Having that person removed obviously is going to have a huge impact on that person's life then. And I will say, I think that Nietzsche, while he is kind of misconstrued and thus maybe not criticized, at least for the right reasons sometimes, I will say that how he's talked about women sometimes doesn't really sit well with me, or hasn't sat well with me, and I don't know if that's out of resentment from then being brought up by his sister and his mother, basically a household of women from that point forward. But some of the things he says, or the way he characterizes certain types of behavior as being feminine, or certain things like that, they've always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, so to speak. But anyway, setting that aside, just wanted to mention that, and how that, if you were to read Nietzsche and come away feeling that same way, well, maybe it has something to do, not excusing it, but maybe it has something to do with, again, his background, and maybe some resentment he holds towards the people that raised him, for whatever reason. He did have an unusual, I would say, upbringing in that regard, for sure. Another thing I'd point out about Nietzsche is that he's very much renowned or known for the artistic quality of his works, kind of similar to Plato, right? Very much, almost like as much an artist as he was a philosopher, right? And it adds a quality, I think, to the works that you don't find otherwise in typical philosophy. Just as reading Plato's dialogues do, it makes it slightly, as I think I mentioned when we talked about what was that, lecture 15, when we talked about the Reductionism, it makes it a little bit more engaging when it's a story, or when it has a more artistic feel, I guess, in some sense. And so Nietzsche's works have that quality as well. And another thing that's I've taken from reading his works is that each book has very much a different feel. The first, his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, it was basically his dissertation, and it reads like your typical philosophical treatise. But then from that point forward, the next couple of books, they are full of aphorisms, short witty passages ranging anywhere from like a sentence to, a few pages, that are all numbered, and then they're interconnected. The idea is they can stand alone, but yet they're interconnected to the other passages that are numbered passages that are, you know, around them. Uh, by the way, who else did that? Schopenhauer. You don't see many figures throughout the history of philosophy writing in these aphorisms, but two figures you do see doing it: Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. So that speaks to, as we'll get to more in a moment here, Schopenhauer's influence on Nietzsche. So, those next few books they read like, um, you know, again, they're full of aphorisms, so they have a completely different feel. And then you get, I think it was book 4, is Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where reads like a long, epic or fairy tale, where you get all kinds of animals speaking, you get metaphor after metaphor, biblical metaphors, you get all kinds of, I mentioned Plato, you get, metaphors related to what, Plato says, the philosopher's obligation. Is it actually an obligation? That's debatable, right? For the enlightened philosopher, does the enlightened philosopher, as Plato discusses in Plato's Republic, did they have an obligation to ascend or descend back into the cave of ignorance and enlighten everybody else? Nietzsche, right, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra descends down the mountain to the marketplace to try to enlighten people. God is dead. What are we going to do? But nobody's ready for him, right? His time has not yet come. Anyway, that's all, metaphorical. Right? It symbolizes what's going on in Plato's Republic. Does Zarathustra, should he feel an obligation to descend down and speak to the masses, to the herd, so to speak? So totally different feel. Continues on that way. His last work, Esse Homo, totally different feel. It's him reflecting back on all his previous works. And, some would argue the Antichrist is the second to last book. You get the same sort of, as he proceeds, he becomes more and more, it seems like, vitriolic and in your face, almost abrasive in his style. And in these last few works, the Antichrist and Esse Homo, a lot of the scholars would argue you can see Nietzsche sort of unraveling mentally. And you could see why some of them would say that. You have, I forgot exactly what some of the section titles are in Esse Homo, but it's like why I am so wise, why I will never be forgotten, and so on and so forth. Right? It sounds like a guy that's in his own world, full of himself. But at the same time, so these do have a different kind of feel to them. But I would argue you still find some of his most matured, focused, well articulated expressions of his positions in those later works. So take it from it what you might in terms of whether or not he seems to be going crazy. I would argue there's still something to be meaningfully gleaned from those last few works as well, even though they do read completely differently, it seems like. So again, the general point, an appreciable thing, at least from my perspective, is how different each of the books feels when you read them. Um, it's not just like reading a philosophy book, reading a philosophy book, reading a philosophy book. There's more to it. So I mentioned 14 books, pretty impressive in its own right to me, that he wrote in that productive time period before he, um, loses it, so to speak. Okay, so moving on to slide 3. Oops. I wanted to talk a little bit about Schopenhauer then. I alluded to Arthur Schopenhauer. I have his dates here. 1788. Basically, all we need to know is that another German dude, another German philosopher that came on the scene shortly before Nietzsche himself, that Nietzsche stumbled upon, according to legend. He stumbles into this, not stumbled into the bookstore, but he was in a bookstore, stumbled upon Schopenhauer and his, I should have brought that in, 2-volume set known as called The World is Will and Representation, massive 2-volume set, which seemed to have made, a significant impact on Nietzsche, one that would be long-lasting and affect him for the rest of his life. Schopenhauer, both positive and negative. Nietzsche has a lot of good things to say about Schopenhauer. After all, he borrows his aphoristic form in some of his own works. He has he's also a critical philosopher himself. So Schopenhauer is known for being a critical philosopher, telling us, not necessarily espousing certain positive views. This is how things are, right? But telling us what's wrong with other people's views, telling us how things are. This is what's wrong with deontology, and this is what's wrong with utilitarianism, and so on. Well, not necessarily espousing a particular view, right? That's critical philosophy. Nietzsche is very well known for his critical philosophy, a la Schopenhauer. They reached a lot of the similar conclusions, but of course, and most significantly, they have one major, maybe unnegotiable difference. It's such a significant difference, right, that it seems to render all these other apparent similarities, insignificant, right? Because it's the most important thing about which they differ, right? The most important thing from Nietzsche's perspective, and that's in their fundamental attitude towards earthly life. Okay, so I mentioned how Schopenhauer is known as being a critical philosopher, and not only that, but known for his pessimism, right? Not having very promising, uplifting things to say. And while I'm not gonna, tell you what he says in the world as will and representation. I'm not going to go into it in detail. It's a huge work. The gist of it, though, I will tell you, and that's all we really need to know then to know what the difference is about, right? What their difference is about, their significant difference. Basically, what Schopenhauer suggests is that we go throughout life and we have all these desires. And again, this is a very simplified version of what Schopenhauer's up to, okay? But we go through life and we constantly have all these wants and desires. And while we might pacify and satisfy some of our desires, it's never enough, and it always feels like we're lacking and wanting, and constantly there's something else that's rendering things unsatisfactory. And in view of this, then Schopenhauer, argues, or how should I put this? Yeah, argues for more or less the resignation from life. Right? Resign ourselves from life, invest ourselves as little as possible in life. And the idea is then when crap hits the fan and things don't go our way, when the pain and suffering inevitably emerge, as they always seem to, it won't sting as much. Right? So, don't become invested in the things that are happening. Right? Don't become emotionally invested. Resign yourself as much as possible. Squeak by, right? Do what you have to just get by until the relief of the end finally comes. In fact, one of the first pieces in philosophy I remember reading, and I don't know how I stumbled upon this, another book I should have brought in, was a book of Schopenhauer's where it was like collected essays, and it was him defending suicide. Not saying go out and kill yourself, but how it could make rational sense, how it's not irrational. And that makes sense given his pessimistic view of life. Okay? Given that fundamentally pessimistic view of life. And so that's what Nietzsche is going to try to reject, or so he says, throughout really all of his, his entire philosophical project. He wants to try to combat that, what he would say is this sickly, diseased sort of mentality, right? Doesn't it seem unhealthy and sickly? As if, you can't, in a healthy, flourishing sort of way, take on life in its entirety. Rather, you're just trying to eke by, doing as little as you can until the end comes. Okay, so again, Schopenhauer is going to represent. Okay, this is kind of a nice segue to a more general issue, right? He's going to represent then this idea of nihilism. Schopenhauer is a nihilist for Nietzsche. He is one who demeans, devalues our earthly life. He detracts from it, right? He's suggesting, don't invest yourself in it. It's better instead to resign from it. Okay? Nietzsche's going to preach the opposite. No, it's better to affirm life in its entirety, to accept it. Okay? The pain and suffering that might be implicit in it is no objection to it, right? That is life, and so be it. And so Nietzsche's going to argue, and what we ought to do instead is affirm life in its entirety. Right? And he's going to suggest a healthy individual, one who's capable of being honest with themselves about reality, this is what they'll do, right? They will affirm life in its entirety. They won't become bogged down by the pain and suffering implicit in earthly life. And they won't express nihilism as a result in its various forms. Okay, now Schopenhauer, as I think mentioned in the introduction, he's going to be a full-blown nihilist, right? He's about as bad as it gets. So this is a spectrum of nihilism down here, right? We have milder forms. He would say, religious individuals are all, insofar as there's this belief in a supernatural realm at least, right? They're all nihilistic in the sense that they're detracting from that move is implicitly detracting from the full value of this life, right? You're removing our attention from this life and placing it, at least to some degree, on something else. That's nihilism. That's a depreciation of life as it is, and that's not embracing it and endorsing it in its entirety, right? And appreciating it to the full extent that you should be. Okay, so to some extent, that would be a version of nihilism. Okay, but religious individuals, they're still Nietzsche. For most of them, from Nietzsche's perspective, they're not as bad as Schopenhauer because at least for them, earthly life still has some sort of redeeming value. Maybe it's a test to see who's befitting of heaven and who's not, or something like that. Right? Whereas for Schopenhauer, the full-blown nihilist, so to speak, it doesn't seem as if earthly life has any redeeming value whatsoever. Right? Again, suicide, right? That's that's a viable route. Why not from the full-blown nihilist perspective? And so again, that's going to be indicative, so we'll talk about that more in the part 2 video, of why he's worried when he expresses God is dead. What happens, right, when they lose their religion, these other slaves, okay, when they lose their religion and fall into this, okay? Nietzsche's going to argue that people need these illusions to get by because they can't handle reality otherwise, right? There's a reason why people indulge in morality and indulge in religion, right? Because they need these illusions to help get by in life. Otherwise, they might become suicidal or something like that. So Nietzsche is worried then what happens when you remove that crutch, when you remove that, as he literally calls them, life-preserving errors. What happens when we remove those? Will they become full-blown Schopenhauers? Will we have more instances of suicide? So these are kinds of worries Nietzsche has, and again, they're reflected by this figure of Schopenhauer, right? A prime example, again, of a full-blown nihilist, one who, it seems anyway, given what he says, completely lacks, any appreciable value of life at all. Right? I guess I should point out, the bottom of slide 3, I mentioned this, right, that it's interesting, again, setting aside your ultimate views regarding Nietzsche, if anyone had good reason to bemoan their pain and suffering in life, it would be Nietzsche. He notoriously suffered a great deal in his own life, was bedridden because of various physiological ailments. We'd have these migraine headaches that would incapacitate him for numerous days on end. And I think that was part of the reason why he ultimately, so he had a position in academia for a while. It's been a while since I looked into this, but, at some early period herein, he resigns his position and moves to the top of the mountains. And that's, in part, I think, because he can't handle those around him. But so, too, I think it was, due to some health concerns as well. So, if anyone had good reason to dwell on the pain and suffering in life, Nietzsche's one of them. And yet, he, at least it seems, constantly preaches life affirmation nonetheless. Now, at the end, when he loses it, did he just give up? Now, most scholars, and the general consensus is, his insanity had a neurological component. He had a physiological disease that finally, that was the manifestation of it. But I've always kind of wondered, did he finally just give up himself and, lose that ability to affirm life in its entirety? I don't know. At any rate, let's go ahead and, having introduced Schopenhauer and then tried to characterize Nietzsche's general project throughout his entire philosophy, let's move on to discuss, I think, some critical elements of his general philosophy, some critical elements in terms of being able to then understand what he has to say about morality, okay, specifically, and so too religion and his criticisms of religion. I do the same thing. I mentioned my dissertation, I think. And so in my dissertation, where I address the issue of the utility of religion, I talk about John Stuart Mill, who we've talked about numerous times, Friedrich Nietzsche, and then William James, three 19th century thinkers who all speak to this issue of the utility of religion. And in my chapter, so I spend a chapter on each one of them. And in my chapter on Nietzsche, I do the same thing. I explain how before you can appreciate and understand what Nietzsche says regarding religion, you have to understand these more general elements, right? His more general view of reality, in order to appreciate then why he thinks religion and morality is so problematic. Okay, so again, that's the impetus for doing what we're doing here. And in the part 2 video, we'll then take a closer look about what he has. We'll take a closer look at what he has to say specifically regarding morality. So the first thing I want to mention regarding his, so this is turning to slide 4. The first thing I want to say regarding his general philosophy, right, is that he is known for his naturalism. And what do we mean here? When you explain things, what do we mean by naturalism? When you explain things, if you're a naturalist, you don't have recourse to anything beyond nature, right? You don't make supernatural appeals. So, what caused the hurricane? It's not going to be God, right, or some supernatural phenomenon. Okay? What explains, that behavior over there? It's not some immoral nature on the part of so and so. Okay? You won't have an appeal to something beyond nature, right? Something that's beyond the physical, objective world around us. Okay, that's the kind of idea here. And I think it's important to point out, it's not that, and Nietzsche is careful about this, it's not that you can't prove these sort of supernatural things exist, that they don't. It's not that he thinks they don't exist, right? It's the idea is you can't have any idea that they do, right? So he doesn't say God doesn't exist. His issue is in people appealing to God as if they did know God existed, or as if that is a credible way to explain something, right? Because they don't, or at least the suggestion is, right, we don't have evidence, okay, for God. But it's important to point out, again, that he doesn't say God does not exist. We just don't have, his point is, if we're being honest, we don't have evidence for God's existence, okay? And I like the way I put it, and so I went back and read the chapter on Nietzsche that I had in my dissertation. I like the way I put it in one paragraph. So I'm gonna quote myself, I guess, in a sense here. This is again indicative of his general take on, again, him being a naturalist and explaining things merely from a naturalist perspective, right, and not having recourse to anything supernatural or beyond nature, and he would include moral notions in that. Okay. So, as I say in that chapter, quote, I'm not going to say quote, although I almost did. With respect to most of life's big questions, Nietzsche believes an honest thinker has no choice but to suspend judgment. So, again, big questions, right? What comes after death? Does God exist? And so on and so forth. Thus, in section 55 of the Antichrist, he writes, and now this is a quote of Nietzsche, there are some questions that people are not entitled to decide the truth of. All the ultimate questions, all the ultimate problems of value are beyond human reason, end quote. Subsequently, Nietzsche vehemently denies any supernatural interpretation of or explanation of any aspect of reality. All concepts suggesting anything unnatural, that is, anything unsubstantiated by the physical world we come to know during our lives on Earth, are for Nietzsche essentially nonsense and illusory. Okay. Consider his temper in the following passage. So this is also taken from the Antichrist. He says, so this is a longer quote, when the natural consequences of an action are not natural anymore, but instead are attributed to spectral, superstitious concepts, to God, to spirit, to the soul, as exclusively moral consequences, as reward, punishment, warning, as a lesson, then the presuppositions of knowledge have been destroyed, and this is the greatest crime against humanity, end quote. So not only is such anti-naturalism dishonest, but he believes that engaging in such deception is ultimately unhealthy, which for him constitutes an even more egregious problem. Okay, so and entertaining these supernatural notions that we can't possibly know to be the case, okay, we're indulging in self-deception. We're not being honest, he's going to say. And he's going to argue that, he always caters to the truth, right? And honesty. He has a preference for that. And so that already is not going to sit well with him. But then he also is going to argue that that's indicative of an unhealthy person, an unhealthy spirit, a disease sort of mentality, right? It's an unhealthy practice to make these sort of appeals, he's going to suggest. Okay, so it's dishonest and it's unhealthy, more importantly. Right? Because again, for him, everything's rooted in life, earthly life as we know it, right? And he's much like, if we're being rational, he's much like Rand. Are we doing what we need to survive and flourish? Okay? That's ultimately what a successful person, so to speak, from Nietzsche is going to do. And so that's what we should focus on. Okay? And what's going on in these appeals to these supernatural kind of things, what happens in that nihilistic tendency, right, is that right, in sort of abandoning this, you're doing that sort of thing, right, and which is unhealthy. Again, that's going to be the problem. It's not indicative of a fully healthy, fully functioning, strong soul or mentality or person or however you want to put it. Right? Okay, so hopefully his take on how we should go about explaining behaviors or um, any sort of phenomenon, right? How we should go about doing that. Hopefully that's clear, right? Nietzsche is very much a naturalist. He doesn't discount with respect to certainty, right, that God exists or, but we shouldn't be making appeals to these supernatural phenomena. And again, moral concepts would belong to that sort of thing. There's nothing in our natural experience to suggest there's a proper way to behave, Nietzsche would argue. Okay? Now we'll go on to his reductionism. So to understand Nietzsche, right, you have to understand the extremely reduced nature of reality from his perspective. And also, so it's kind of from a couple of different perspectives. What's real? The moment, in the moment, now. Reality, and the idea is reality is constantly in flux. There's nothing static about it, nothing permanent, nothing objective, right? He would be one who would fall into the camp that would suggest you can't step into the same river twice. How could you? Right? There's something always changing about it, right? And water's in slightly different places and so on, right? There's reality is constantly in flux, and part of that then is going to entail a degree of danger. We don't know what's actually coming next, right? Because there isn't anything static about it, and that's going to explain, for Nietzsche partly, right, the psychology then behind this slavish mentality to try to act as if we can, right? This is part of the problem, is that we don't like the danger and the possibility of pain and suffering that might come, right, with not knowing what's going to happen. This moment by moment sort of existence. And so we create illusions that'll help us feel more comfortable with what is in fact a dangerous reality, right? Well, no matter what happens, right, things will be made right in a sort of afterlife, right? It doesn't matter what trials and tribulations I endure in this existence, it'll all be justified in the end, or something like that. Okay. So they don't. There's this general on the part of slaves, this lack of appreciation, who we would call slaves, right? This lack of appreciation for this fluid sense of reality, right? That there is nothing that's objectively true of reality. And he also thinks of reality in a reductionist sense, and in the way that he even approaches life, right? In this sense that the very idea of he talked about the plant, how the idea of a plant is misleading, and that we're talking as if there's this unity, this thing called a plant, when really he wants to suggest there's just hundreds of different drives that are actually underlying this so-called plant, right? There's actually a multitude of various drives that are together, steering it in a certain direction. So too with our behavior, right? We have a tendency to talk as if it's just one, we're one entity making one decision. When no, there's a whole multitude of factors or drives constantly at play that are determining everything we do, in some sense, he would say, right? And that are at least factoring into what we're doing. And we have a tendency to completely ignore, 99% of it, and act as if, there's just this one way we're behaving and we're completely in control. No, he's saying, really all there are is billions of disparate life forces or drives, right? And some of them are kind of muddled together or happen to coexist in this entity called Dr. Brad Musil, right? But I mean, it's really just, what we tend not to see is that there's lots of underlying drives, right, to belie that Dr. Brad Musil. Hopefully some of that's making sense. I know some of this gets pretty complicated when you get into this, metaphysics sort of stuff, what is real and so on. But again, the idea is it takes a very reductionist approach to things, right? What is reality? It's very much in the moment. It's constantly changing. There's nothing static or permanent or objectively fixed about it. And what's more, there are always constantly thousands of various forces at play that are steering everything that's happening. You can't pinpoint and label, this is what caused this, as if you've isolated one thing. Immoral behavior on the part of Joe is what caused him to murder Sally or whatever, right? You're always in labeling things as such. He's going to point out you're always, in some sense, mischaracterizing the truth, right? No, there were a plethora of various factors that ended up leading to that behavior that we ended up seeing. Again, hopefully you don't have to have a complete understanding of this, but hopefully the sorts of things he's pointing out or emphasizing are kind of making sense at this point. And then as long as you have a kind of a general grasp of his general points here, then you'll be in a better position, again, to understand what he's saying regarding morality, okay, and how this will then apply to that. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. I want to talk for a moment about this idea of will to power. Okay. Again, I am reminded of Rand when I think of this notion of will to power. Okay. In the sense that it's really just him describing life as it naturally is. Okay, now humans have a tendency, unfortunately, to screw it up, right, and to limit their own will to power, so to speak, just like Rand talks about. Excuse me, how we have a tendency to act on the standard of death as suicidal or irrational animals. Very similar, again, what Nietzsche's doing here, and that's one of the reasons why in the Rand lecture I suggested, I have to think that she was at least familiar with Nietzsche, given how similar she makes, not only that she makes the same points, but how similar she presents them oftentimes. Okay, so we're already familiar with kind of what Nietzsche's going to say, right, with respect to will to power, insofar as we're familiar already with the sorts of things Rand said. Okay. He basically says, and then he talks about this idea of will to power, and I should say from the outset, so this is slide 5, should acknowledge from the outset that there is no consensus necessarily regarding what he means by this idea of the will to power, just like there's arguably no consensus regarding anything Nietzsche says. Right? He's notoriously open to interpretation and debate, as I've been alluding to. So, acknowledge that, what does he mean? There's debate about it, okay? But I've read a lot in Nietzsche, and I will also say that he appeals this idea of will to power, whatever it might mean, throughout his entire writing career, from the very, not necessarily Birth of Tragedy, but the first few books all the way to the end. He appeals this idea of the will to power, and so, granting that there is some debate about what it amounts to, I would argue that, again, it's very reminiscent of what Rand suggests. It's just a description of what life entails. Okay? And it's just a depiction of what all of life is. This idea that all of life, insofar as it's living, will just do whatever it needs to do to survive and flourish, to acquire power, right, if you will. It'll do what's necessary to survive and flourish, and that entails, oftentimes, what's necessary is to exploit its surroundings, whether that be, the environment or resources or sometimes even people or, other species or other living things, right? So everything that's insofar as it's alive, it has this so-called will to power. It exudes this will to power. Even slavish human beings, individuals, are still in some sense expressing their will to power in endorsing and expressing their slavish moral theories, even as ill-founded as they are, right, Nietzsche will still explain them as an expression of this, as the slave trying to do what the slave can to survive and flourish, to get by. Right? So one way or another, all of life will do what it takes to survive and flourish. Okay? Now, implicitly, he's going to suggest that the slave is not doing this well. That's why the slave is unhealthy. Right? It's not. It's kind of cutting off its natural will to power, right? Not being as truly strong and healthy as it could. And by the way, um, what is that movie? You Can't Handle the Truth. I always forget it when I do this lecture. I always rely on my students to remind me. I have a terrible memory, as you guys know by now. Few Good Men? Few Good Men, maybe. You Can't Handle the Truth. That is the, um, what's the word? That is the allegation that Nietzsche is raising against all the slaves. They can't handle the truth of reality, specifically, typically, the pain and suffering in it. And so they indulge in all these self-deceptions and so on and so forth. And in doing so, he would say they're not exerting their will to power as well as they could be, and as a healthy of form as they could be. And hopefully that'll become clearer in the part 2 video and as we proceed in general. While I'm thinking about it, what I was jotting down is this a point that I've had in the back of my mind, been intending to raise here, is that, and I should have said this in the introduction when I was introducing Nietzsche, and that's that he is not a moralist. Okay, he reminds me of David Hume in the sense that they think of themselves as psychologists more so than maybe philosophers, right? They are interested explicitly in human nature. Hume says explicitly on studying human nature, and so too it seems to be the case with Nietzsche, right? He's interested in describing, not prescribing, right? Describing how reality is, specifically with us humans and how we tend to work, right or wrong, good or evil, right? This is what humans seem to tend to do, and then he gets into why he thinks that's the case as well, right? Why they tend to indulge in all these illusions. But he really sees himself as a kind of psychologist, right? Exploring our human tendencies and psychological tendencies, and why it is that we tend to do the sorts of things that we do. And so, it makes sense to mention that now then, right, when we're talking about will to power. Well, we have a tendency, right, to, if left to our natural devices, right, to do what we have to survive and flourish, to exploit our environment and our, whatever resources we can, to survive and flourish. And those of us that are strong and healthy, we'll embrace life in its entirety as we do this, and we'll do this in a fully fleshed out version, in a healthy sort of way. Whereas those that are slavish, right, who can't handle the truth about reality, will do that. They'll still do this, right, but in a very diseased sort of way. Just as we can have a physiological ailment, right? We can break a bone. Well, so too, 99.9% of us have a kind of psychological ailment, if you will, right? A kind of diseased mentality, that hampers us. Of course, we don't realize it. Nietzsche, the psychologist, is going to try to bring it to light for us, right? But we're hampering our, as Rand says as well, right? Given the self-sacrificing tendencies of religion and morality, we're hampering our true potential, right? And our actual capacity to be as strong and healthy as we can be. And we're cutting off implicitly in some of these self-deceptions, we're cutting off our natural will to power. Okay? And that's the sense in which it's unhealthy. Okay. Again, this idea of will to power, it's not an objection to life. It's not something we should try to explain away and defend. He just thinks that is how life works, right? Everything that's alive, all these various life forces, they're going to do what they can do to continue to be alive and to flourish. Look at the rest of nature, right? Just as Rand says, and you see this is just how it works, right? Some of those life forces are going to die off then, right? So that the other ones can continue to survive and flourish, and that's just how it works, right? But it's only us that convince ourselves of certain things like everyone is equal and we should all survive for as long as possible, and so far and so forth, or so on and so forth, right? No, these sorts of things are not actually, true in nature, Nietzsche's going to say. They're self-deceptive. Okay? They're, again, indicative of illusions on our part. Okay, so turning to slide 6, I mentioned this before, right? Nietzsche himself, it's all about honesty, right? He tends to value this honesty. So in the part 2 video, I'll mention a quote of his, and we've alluded to this in various lectures. You know, this idea is ignorance bliss. Is the path to truth painful, right? Is it the case that these are two divergent paths? Is ignorance bliss, right? So one who says yes, right, the whole implication seems to be that, right, these are divergent paths. If you pick one, you're going to have to not have the other. And, you know, in many ways, and including that quote that I'll have at the end of the part 2 lecture, Nietzsche seems to be on board here, right? We can't handle the truth because it would make life too unbearable. And so for the sake of happiness, right, we deceive ourselves and we don't take this path. But Nietzsche and other masters, they're strong enough. They can survive and by taking on life as it is in its entirety. They don't need to explain certain aspects of life away and so on and so forth, right? They can take this path. And that's exactly what he prefers. And so, you know, honesty is the best policy, as I say on slide 6 for him. Right? But for most, presumably they're taking this path, right? Insofar as they're not being truthful with themselves, Nietzsche suggests. They aren't, you know, they're not adopting what any honest thinker ought to, according to Nietzsche, that naturalistic take on phenomena. They don't acknowledge the reductionist elements of reality as they should, Nietzsche says. And so on and so forth. So they're not being honest with themselves. Of course, a lot of that's probably not explicit in their mind. It's not something they're conscious of, but it's going on nonetheless, Nietzsche would suggest. So he expresses a great deal of disdain, you know, whatever the reasons for those who do not go this way. He definitely prefers this, and expresses a lot of, again, criticism for those, the majority of us, you know, the significant majority of us, what is it, 99.9% probably, that he would label as slaves in one way or another, right? We're indulge in one form of self-deception or another. You believe in morality, you're a slave, right? You have religious beliefs, you're a slave. Right? So he has a great deal of disdain then for 99.9% of us. He prefers this path. Okay, so I made those points. Should be pretty obvious, right, what he's preaching. Turning to slide 7. This is what it's all about. Okay? And he's combating, again, nihilism in all its forms, but he's especially on guard against that full-blown extreme version of nihilism that we find in Schopenhauer. All that we know, he wants to say, is, through our experience, if we're being honest with ourselves, is this life here on earth. Okay? Thus, what are we doing making any appeals to anything supernatural? Let's be honest, embrace the only life we know in its entirety. And to do otherwise, he thinks, is being dishonest, and it's not a healthy practice, as I've tried to intimate. And it's, and that tendency in general is, again, what he associates with this idea of nihilism. So any human being who seeks to denounce, deny, or resent this life, or any particular aspect of it, like the pain and suffering in it, try to explain it away as if it needs some sort of justification, whether they do that explicitly or implicitly, right? That's who he's going to mean. That sort of tendency, that's what he means by nihilism. Such a person who does that, they're nihilistic. Right? And as I've suggested, as will become clear then as we go to the part 2 video, right? They're going to be unhealthy, sickly, and so on. And we'll flesh out why he thinks that's the case. So that's kind of the segue then, right? For the part 2 video then, all of this that we talked about is going to underlie then what he has to say about master and slave moral theories. Right? The master is going to be, as we'll see, completely honest about reality. And in doing so, the upshot with respect to morality is going to be that they're going to concede that there is no such thing as a proper way that we ought to behave. Okay? Um, right? So in some sense, the master has moved beyond good and evil. So the master moral theories really aren't any moral theories at all, right? In that sense, they're not moral at all. And one who has a master mentality won't view things um, through this moral lens at all. Okay. So slaves, of course, right, will do the opposite, as we'll see. They're viewing everything through moral terms. Okay, same thing with religion. That's going to apply, but we'll set aside religion more, I should say, in the part 2 video, right? We're going to focus exclusively then on what he has to say about morality, and it's going to say that basically um, that the truth of the matter is there's no difference between, I should have brought this up from the outset. There's no difference between, I think this does a really good job of capturing what Nietzsche is after here. There's no difference between me saying, I value vanilla ice cream, and me saying, I value a murderless society. But so many of us are conditioned to think, right, and view things through a moral lens, and to think there's something special about the latter value, right? That there's something special about valuing a murderless society, as if there's something more objective about it. And if you don't subscribe to that value, if you don't have that value, there's something wrong with you, right? There's an issue. Whereas we don't reproach people for not valuing vanilla ice cream. The whole upshot, though, what Nietzsche is going to try to convince us of is that there is no difference in reality. And the master sees this, right? In reality, all we have are subjective preferences. They both are indicative of subjective preference and nothing more. Valuing vanilla ice cream and valuing a murderless society, right? They're both indicative of subjective preference. Neither one's indicative of what we ought to do, no matter who we are at any time. Right? There's nothing special about either one. So that's what he's going to try to convince us of then. Again, given his position of moral nihilism or moral skepticism or amoral. What ends up happening, though, right, through these slavish moral theories, is we end up sort of canonizing certain values as if, again, there's something special about them. I mentioned, alluded to earlier, right, this whole idea of equality and how everyone ought to solicit equal consideration from us. That's an illusion, right? You can have that value, but Nietzsche wants to say why. Instead, right? Don't remember the whole Rand point about love. Why treat everyone the same? Why feel as if that's obligatory, right? And that you ought to have that value. There's something wrong with you if you don't have that value. When in reality, Nietzsche would argue, things are different. People are different. People do warrant different treatment. Not everyone is equal. Again, the same sort of point that we were raising with respect to Rand, and giving out your love to everyone. I love you, I love you, I love you. What does your love mean anymore, right? So, again, he would say that, that these kinds of tendencies are futile. They're not productive in some sense. Again, this sort of tendency to suggest certain values are special, right? They're not, right? That's going to be the ultimate argument of the moral skeptic of Nietzsche. And there is ultimately no difference between me valuing vanilla ice cream and me valuing a murderless society. And in reality, right, there's no difference. In reality, it's okay if you don't value equality, because in reality, he would say there is no equality. Again, these are some of the points we'll draw out with more detail than in the part 2 video. He's going to try to explain or justify his moral skepticism in general by teasing out, what's problematic with respect to the slavish mentality and what is appealing, conversely, right, about the master mentality, his own mentality, naturally. So we'll go through those. And like I said, we'll also hit on some peripheral points, talk a little bit more about the expression God is dead and how that, of course, is oftentimes misinterpreted. Talk about how he thinks we ought to judge progress and think of ourselves as succeeding, right? What does a good life look like from Nietzsche's perspective? say a little bit more about that and how it's not as many people living for as long as possible, but rather maybe it has something to do with interesting things going on by way of different people doing different things. And of course, we'll say a little bit about his reflections on historicity, right? Our ability to, sort of escape the moment and reflect on what's happened in the past or anticipate what's happening in the future. And he's going to tell us why that's problematic, tends to be problematic. And so we'll talk about that as well. And we'll end, as I mentioned, with Nietzsche himself via a bunch of quotes from Nietzsche telling us, sort of summarizing all the points we've made in this first part video, but then all the points as well that we'll make in the second part video. So that's it. That's it for part one. Hopefully some of this made sense, and I'll see you then for part two. Thanks.